89.1 FM Rich Radio. Hashtag Surmount Kalamitan Ka-Heaven.
Hello everyone! Mabuhay, mapagpala, mapayapa at malusog na buhay sa ating lahat. Mahayapat manahim na Aldo para hindang senior high school learners ng Kalamitan High School. Sana all at suminteng masalting akabiyan. I hope you guys are having an amazing day and welcome to another virtual learning session. Yako inte kayong Sir Mel Santos, broadcasting via our own radio station, 89.1 FM Rich Radio, hashtag Surmount Kalamitan Ka-Heaven. So just a reminder mga Ka-Heaven, to enrich our learning experience and to serve as a reference for review of this learning session, a recorded video of the same episode can also be accessed through our social media platform pages on YouTube or Facebook. So you can pause, rewind, or go at your own pace in learning about the contents of this study session. So mga Ka-Heaven, I hope you are all ready for another study session right at the comforts of our homes, as together we will embark on another learning journey in 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world. Now, have your paper and pen handy for note-taking along with your self-learning module as we are about to engage in another literary adventure. So set your mind and heart, have yourselves feeling at ease and focused to get the most out of learning from today's topic. On this episode, we will be exploring the elements of a short story. Let's keep in mind our learning goals for this study session. Demonstrate understanding of a short story. Analyze short story by identifying its basic elements. Appreciate the use of multimedia in sharing the lessons learned from a short story. And perform a self or peer assessment in evaluating classroom. So these learning goals can definitely be achieved by listening attentively to our discussion, as well as from reading and answering the activity sheets on your self-learning module. And should you have questions, you could always reach me out at my personal messenger account. So mga Ka-Heaven, let's get started to roll. What comes to your mind when you hear the word elements? I'm sure a lot of you are reminded of the 118 elements from the periodic table in your chemistry class when you were in junior high school, right? Today, we will discover that in literature, particularly in writing a short story or any work of fiction for that matter, it also has its sets of elements that you need to bear in mind, especially how each of them functions. Not only to be able to write a truly engaging story or be immersed emotionally when you read one, but also to efficiently help us better assess one's literary work. After all, performing a self or peer assessment in evaluating one's work is our ultimate learning goal in this study session. But worry not, since unlike your chemistry periodic table with 118 elements, a short story or any work of fiction only has 6 elements. So when I say work of fiction, we are not only referring to short story, but any story per se, in prose form, of course. It could be in the form of a novel or even a narrative poem such as an epic. Even the stories from the movies you love, they all follow to have all these 6 elements in the storytelling process. When we say element, we are referring to the components, the single characteristics that makes part of a whole, such as in a puzzle, like also in the process of cooking. A certain dish will not be called and known for by its own name, say sinigang, if one ingredient is not there. In sinigang, if the main ingredient of tamarind or vinegar is missing, its distinct sour taste will not then be achieved, which is sinigang is known for. Thus, it will definitely lose its unique feature or even its identity, so to speak, when said ingredient is not present, defeating its purpose as a sour soup dish altogether. By the way, speaking of sinigang, I just have to remind you, as one of your preliminary tasks in your module, don't forget to read the short story entitled Sinigang. Just to give you an idea about this quite interesting short story, this was written by Dr. Marie Aubrey J. Villaseran, a professor of the Department of English and Comparative Literature in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She has a BA and MA in creative writing from the University of the Philippines and was conferred a PhD in sociology by La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She teaches and writes creative nonfiction, and her research interests are gender and migration. In the story, the main character, Lisa, narrates how she deals with the issue of her father having an affair with another woman and how it emotionally separates her from him. Alright, I think I would just stop right there. I guess that is enough teaser for you to read the whole story, right? And one more thing, before and while you read the story, keep in mind the questions that you need to answer in Activity 1. Scan through the questions first before reading the story. The questions will help you better understand the story and figure out how each element in the story work out. It will also help you to easily answer the subsequent activities. Always refer to the table of contents so you will not miss out an activity. Going back to the topic at hand, as what I have mentioned, in any story or work of fiction, if one of the 6 elements is missing, it will potentially defeat its purpose or lose its value or even what it's known for or its so-called identity. It will even compromise the intended meaning that should go with the story. To better understand what I mean, let's begin exploring each one of these elements of a short story. Elements are simply the pieces, or as what I have mentioned, they are like the ingredients that make up a dish. But first, let's define what a short story is. A short story is a brief fictional prose narrative that is shorter than a novel and usually deals with only a few characters and talks about a single event or experience. So the key phrase there is short story being a brief fictional prose narrative that tells a single event or experience. Short story as a work of fiction, it is in narrative form created from the imagination. When we say narrative, we are talking about a story that has characters and events and actual dialogues that characters express. However, in the case of a short story, all the events and characters are made up. In other words, they are all simply inventions or a product of the creative imagination of the author. The definition also notes that a short story is in the prose form, and what better way of telling a story or narrative than through the prose form, right? Again, when we say prose, it is the form of literature that is with free flow of words or sentences without measurement scheme used in poetry or even in songs. The definition also states that a short story tells about a single event or experience. In other words, it's not usually multiple situations that explains why it is shorter than a novel. All the short stories are texts made up by the author that are apparently not true, but they are often based on real-life experiences, which explains the reason why they can be emotionally engaging. Another reason that makes short stories easy to relate with is it makes use of figurative language or literary devices to capture the hearts of the readers. Again, a short story has 6 basic elements that you as a reader should look for when analyzing one. Every story or any work of fiction begins with a seed of idea. Hence, the author should think of these basic elements when writing a story. Although not all stories put equal importance on every aspect, Each of these elements must be expected in the story. The six basic elements of a short story include character, setting, plot, conflict, theme, and point of view. Okay, let's begin with character. I guess all of us would agree that a story would not stand on its own without characters, right? A character in a short story is a person, in some stories, an animal, or even a certain supernatural creature such as mermaid who takes part in the action of the story or other literary work. Every story needs a character. It could be in the form of a person, an animal, or as what I have mentioned, even a creature like Ariel and Ursula of Little Mermaid. Sometimes, a character in a story could even be an inanimate object that was given life. An example of this is Mrs. Potts and Chip in Beauty and the Beast, which were given life as mother and son, but are actually in the form of moving and talking teapot and cup. Alright, so the way an author develops the character in a story is very important in making the story appeal to the readers, as it is what will sustain engagement and interest from the audience or readers. More often than not, a story becomes really emotionally engaging when we can relate with the character, right? Or if we see ourselves in the shoes of the character. The two most important characters in a short story are the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is considered as the main character or most important of all the characters. We often call it as the bida in the story, right? It is the most dynamic character, or in other words, it is the character who learns something or undergoes some changes. Dynamic means being active. Thus, the protagonist is considered so as it's always expected to go through the process of change throughout the course of the story. The changes in the protagonist could either be external, such as in terms of his physical appearance, or internal, such as in terms of his attitude or belief in life. More often than not, the internal changes happens in the protagonist when he reaches a certain realization that will lead him to decide to do something we least expect as audience or readers to occur in the story, or something out of the box that will transpire in the actions of the main character. Some stories depict the protagonist as the hero of the story, such as Superman or our very own Darna or Captain Barbell, right? While in other stories, the protagonist is not considered as hero, as he has not done anything outright and literally heroic like Superman, whose pursuit was to save mankind. Stories in which the protagonist is not considered a hero is mostly common in rom-com or romantic comedies and dramas. In any case, the story always revolves around the protagonist. Meanwhile, the antagonist is the character that challenges the main character. It is often known as the villain, or what we call as contrabida. It has no concern for the well-being of the main character. The antagonist may be a person, the nature, the society, or any intangible matter that contends with or creates a problem for the protagonist. Next element is setting. The place and time when the story happens is called the setting. So the setting may be based on real place and real time, such as in Jose Rizal's Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, which featured a setting based on the actual environment or ambience during the Spanish occupation in the Philippines, or even in a lot of movies nowadays that you might have already watched or had come across. Or if you are familiar with the Filipino themed Netflix anime series entitled Trece, despite being a story with supernatural characters, the setting was based on the actual bustling city environment of Metro Manila. So the setting in a short story may also be based, of course, on the author's imagination. Setting helps build background and create images in the mind, and it helps set the tone and mood of the story. When analyzing the setting of the story, consider where the action is taking place. Most authors use descriptive words to describe the landscape, scenery, buildings, season, or weather. to provide a strong sense of setting, which will help the reader visualize the story and connect to the story's plot. That leads me to the third element, which is plot. A plot is the actual story, it is what the story is all about. It is also the series of events and characters' actions that lead to the highest point of interest in a short story. So these series of related events in a story intend to solve a problem or conflict the main character or protagonist faces. A plot comprises of a classical structure which have five parts or phases in the process of telling the story. Its process is often illustrated in pyramid form. So these parts of plot structure include exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, or denouement. The exposition part in the classical plot structure is the beginning of the story. Looking at its pyramid illustration, exposition is found on the left hand base or on the left side of the lowest portion of the pyramid. This is where the author introduces the characters, identifies where the story is happening, and establishes the main conflict. The way the main conflict is established is through what is often called the inciting incident or narrative hook, which aims to hold and sustain the interest of the reader. The inciting incident is often somewhat alarming in nature or something that will seriously make the reader become worried about the protagonist, that will be hard for the audience or readers to let go watching or reading the story as it unfolds. Alright, so we will be taking the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as an example to further illustrate each part of the plot structure since it is one of the most familiar stories we know, right? So, in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, after all the characters were introduced and the setting was established in the exposition part, the narrative hook or inciting incident was set in when the wicked queen ordered the huntsman to kill Snow White. Apparently, this was the scene that made the audience felt alarmed, or it made us seriously worried about Snow White for the first time. Thus, it hooked and held us captive to watch out for more what is coming, right? This narrative hook or inciting incident naturally led to the second part of the classical plot structure, which is the rising action or the complications. The collective event of rising action occurs as you begin to move throughout the story. This is where conflicts start to build. In the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, following the order of the wicked queen to have Snow White killed by the huntsman, it predisposed to complication which in turn built tension, such as the huntsman changing his mind to kill Snow White, deciding to let her go, and urging her to hide in the forest. This led Snow White then to face the most challenging moment of her life when she wandered in the forest, lost consciousness, and was ultimately rescued by the seven dwarfs. Upon the return of the huntsman to the castle, he faked the death of Snow White by showing the wicked queens a pig's heart, proclaiming it as belonging to Snow White. So noon pa meron na palang fake news. So that's what the huntsman did. He faked the death of Snow White by showing the wicked queen a pig's heart, and he proclaimed it as belonging to Snow White. This explains why the rising action part of the plot structure is placed on the slope of the pyramid illustration, specifically on the left side, appearing to be approaching towards the summit point of the pyramid because of the rise of tension from the series of conflicts. Alright, but before we even reach the climax of the story, we will be confronted first with what is called the crisis. Alright, so the crisis is the point in which the curiosity, uncertainty, and tension are the greatest. The crisis in the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that followed after the series of complication or rising actions was the event when the wicked queen discovered Snow White is alive through the magic mirror, which led her to decide on carrying out the murder of Snow White by herself. So the queen decided when she learned or discovered that Snow White's still alive through the magic mirror, it led her to decide on carrying out the murder of Snow White by herself through her plan of baiting her to eat a poisonous apple, which of course led to the story's highest point, or the so-called climax. Alright. Climax is the most exciting part of a short story or any work of fiction. Climax is the part in the story when important decisions are made or important things are discovered. It is the highest point, which may take in the shape of a decision, an action, an affirmation, or a realization. This is like when you're sitting on the edge of your seat and wait for what will happen next. Again, to continue with the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the seeming climax in the story was when the Wicked Queen went to the forest, disguised herself as an old lady, and brought a poisonous apple. What the Wicked Queen did was she lured Snow White to take a bite of the apple, which caused her to fall into a death-like sleep. It was established at this point that the magic spell will only be broken, or Snow White will only wake up, if kissed by her one great love. Apparently, this is the most exciting part of the story because somehow we see a twist in the story that we never see coming until when Snow White fell into this death-like sleep. So that plot twist definitely held audience in anticipation of a Prince Charming finally giving his kiss to Snow White to break the magic spell. Following climax is the falling action. So this point occurs after the climax as the problem in the story start to work themselves out. The excitement becomes less and less as the conflict is resolved. So these are, in falling action, it consists of actions or events which follows climax, of course, leading up to the ending before the resolution. So the falling action in the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was when the prince appeared on a journey and found Snow White lying in the woods in a glass domed coffin built by the dwarfs, leading to the resolution or denouement of the story. Resolution or denouement. Resolution or denouement is the solution to the problem in a story. The solution may not be what you hope for, but as long as it fits the story in tone and theme, the conflict has been resolved. In other words, not all stories have happy ending, but it will always be the point in which threads are finally tied all together. Or in the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, it was the happily ever after type of ending because the prince arrived, broke the magic spell, and finally awakened Snow White through his kiss. So it's an event confirming the prince is Snow White's one great love, and so they live happily ever after. Alright, so those are the 5 parts of plot structure: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, or denouement. Let's discover the 4th element of a short story, the conflict. Conflict is the element of short story or any work of fiction which refers to the opposition of forces that may set forth the problems, issues, and challenges of various forms and sources that the main character needs to face and to deal with. Every story needs to have a problem, and this problem is called conflict. The main character or the protagonist needs to have someone or something to challenge him. Without conflict, the story will not go anywhere and will not be very interesting to the readers. In the story Snow White, do you think it will still be worth to watch if Snow White never faced any conflict and only met the prince in the end? I guess it would have been a really boring story without those conflicts unfolding in the story, right? Simply put, conflict is the struggle between two opposing forces. Good conflict should move the story forward. It should create tension, and of course, it should help the characters develop. The main character may be faced with one of the 4 different types of conflict. These four types of conflicts are man versus self, man versus man, man versus society, and man versus nature. Man versus self conflict develops from a protagonist's inner struggles and may depend on a character trying to decide between good and evil or overcome self-doubts. Man versus self is therefore inherently an internal type of conflict, since characters with this type of conflict usually struggles from something within themselves. William Shakespeare's Hamlet is a classic example, particularly in the opening phrase of his soliloquy that goes, "To be or not to be, that is the question." Sounds familiar, right? So in this soliloquy, Hamlet contemplates death and suicide, whining about the pain and unfairness of life, but acknowledging that the alternative might be worse. Another example of man versus self conflict was in the movie Fight Club. The main character, played by Ed Norton, struggles with a life of extreme boredom. Everything in his life is so routine, it's literally driving him insane or crazy. He has been in such a monotonous and eventful life for so long, he doesn't even know how to go after his main need, which is living his life with purpose and being fulfilled. Of course, that all changes with the inciting incident when he meets another character named Tyler Durden, played by Brad Pitt. Man versus man is a situation in which two characters have opposing desires or interests. The typical scenario is a conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. This is an external conflict. So, most thrillers and mysteries have this type of conflict, such as Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. Another example for this could be how Marty McFly in the movie Back to the Future is constantly bumping heads with a high school bully named Biff. Marty has a pretty straightforward goal after a time-traveling experiment goes awry. He ends up in the 1950s, inadvertently screws up his fate by being there, and his goal is to make sure his mom and dad fall in love. Otherwise, he will cease or stop to exist. The constant external conflict and tension rises as Biff constantly punks Marty's dad and physically harasses his mom in high school, to the point where his dad decides to not even ask Marty's mother out on a date. So that becomes a big problem. If they don't have a date, they can fall in love. If they don't fall in love, then Marty doesn't get born. Next is man versus society. In this type of conflict, a character must take on a society itself and not a single person. The character stands at odds with societal norms and realizes the necessity to work against these norms. This is an external conflict. Examples of man versus society are John Steinbeck's The Pearl, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Now keep in mind, societies are made up of people, so in essence, this one is sort of like character versus characters in a way. Another good example of man versus society would be if your protagonist was fighting against his own government, or if they were all on trial for a crime they didn't commit. Essentially, your protagonist is going against the grain and against the status quo. Remember that movie, The Fugitive? Harrison Ford played Dr. Richard Kimball, a man who escaped from the law in an attempt to find his wife's killer and clear his own name. There's massive manhunt going on to bring him in, and being led by U.S. Marshals hell-bent on his capture. Now, Richard Kimball is by all means a law-abiding citizen, but that same law that was put in place by society to protect him could get him a life sentence or the death penalty in this particular scenario. So he takes matters into his own hands. Some additional examples would be movies like V for Vendetta, The Hunger Games, John Q starring Denzel Washington. All three of these movies are good examples of where the protagonist takes matters into their own hands and goes toe-to-toe with society in some kind of way. The last one is man versus nature. In this type of conflict, a character is tormented by natural forces such as storms or animals. This is also an external conflict. Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea and Moby Dick by Herman Melville are examples of this type of conflict. When we explore man versus nature, we find that our protagonists often face elements of nature that are completely out of their control. The protagonists either struggle to solve, survive, or overcome that conflict in order to gain control back in their life. Other good examples of this are movies like The Day After Tomorrow, Castaway, 127 Hours, The Life of Pi, The Grey, and The Martian starring Matt Damon. Overall, these types of conflicts are what writers play around with when they write a story to make the narrative itself a compelling one or something that you would watch till the end. A story cannot move forward effectively without conflict regardless of the genre. As they will always say, conflict is the soul of a story. Without conflict, characters are just going through everyday life where only the most uninteresting events are being highlighted in the story. The next element of a short story is theme. This is the central idea in a short story and a general truth. This is considered as the author's message to the readers. In any work of art, the theme is the underlying message that the writer would like to get across. Maybe it's a theme of bravery, perseverance, or undying love. Whether you're reading a novel or a short story, there will always be a pervasive theme woven through the story. You'll notice the characters embracing or turning away from the theme time and again, and you'll see how their relationship to the theme impacts the events that unfold. It is important not to confuse the theme and the main idea. The theme is an underlying message, say, of bravery, of hope or love. The main idea, however, is simply what the story is about. In a way, the main idea is a tight summary of the plot. So how do we find the theme in a story? There are 3 questions that will help you unearth what the theme is in a story. The first one is, what problem is the character facing? Then we have, what lesson did the main character learn? And the third one is, what message can you take away from the story? Once you hit the third question, you'll be well on your way to understanding the theme of the story. So let's take a look at the difference between theme and morals. If the theme drives home the central message that the writer would like to convey, then how is it any different from the moral of the story? In truth, themes are far more general than the moral of the story. They are broad concepts, such as the examples that I have given you earlier. An undying love can be your theme, courage, revenge, friendship, death. These virtues are examples of themes in a story. On the other hand, the moral is a specific lesson that the author is trying to teach. That's why when we read stories, we often ask, what is the moral of the story? What is the moral lesson? Because it's literally the lesson that you derive from a story. And again, the theme can be more generalized. There can also be more than one theme in a story. Readers uncover themes as they go along because it consistently reappears throughout the work of fiction or non-fiction. As such, a moral can be a theme, but the theme doesn't have to be the moral of the story. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, one could argue that the theme is the power of love. Love drew these 2 characters to one another, and nothing was going to stop them from coming together. However, the moral of the story is quite different. The case could be made that the moral of the story is not to let old family wounds carry on needlessly, or don't let your ego rule your life, especially when it comes at the expense of your children's happiness. So the moral, repair old family wounds, can be one of the themes of the story, but the theme, undying love, is not necessarily the moral of the story. Throughout every bit of character development and conflict resolution, a theme should be prevalent. It should define the whole story. It's the glue that binds the story together. If the theme is courage, we'll see it in most of the pivotal plot elements. We'll admire the main character from his strength and resolute behavior. We'll see it unfold no matter what the setting or the number of character is. So the next time you read a new work of fiction or non-fiction, jot down notes pertaining to the theme or themes. See how many you can find. After you've turned that final page, see what central message you've taken away with you. Perhaps it will inspire you to live a better tomorrow. Finally, we are now on the sixth element of a short story, the point of view. Point of view is the way the story is told or narrated. It is also known as the vantage point that the writer uses to narrate the story. The following are the types of point of view in a short story. The first one is the first person, where the narrator participates in and tells the story using the pronoun I. With first person point of view, the main character is telling the story. Readers will see the words I, me, or we in the first person writing. It is commonly used for narratives and autobiographies. First person point of view can be singular or plural. The singular form uses I or me, and the plural form uses the word we. Both are used to give the writer's personal perspective. Next is the limited third person. In limited third person, the narrator is not in the story and narrates using the pronouns she or he. Also, the narrator is unable to see into the minds of the characters. The last type of point of view is the omniscient third person. Here, the narrator is not in the story and tells the story using the pronouns she or he. In this point of view, the narrator can tell the thoughts of the characters and he can see into their minds. What point of view you choose to use in writing depends on how you want the story directed to the reader. If you are telling a story from the writer's perspective, use the first person point of view to provide a sense of intimacy. To tell the story from the outside perspective, with the ability to have an overview of the piece, a third person point of view can then be more appropriate. Always be consistent in your writing and stick with one point of view throughout. This makes it easier for the reader to understand your angle. And that wraps up our learning session for the elements of a short story. In summary, we have discussed 6 elements of a short story, which include first, the character, wherein we have talked about the difference between the two most important characters, which are the protagonist and the antagonist. Then we have the setting, which is essentially the time and place of the story. The third element is the plot or the series of events that take place in a story. We have also talked about in great detail the parts of a plot structure, which include exposition, the rising action, climax, falling action, and the resolution. Then the fourth element, which is the conflict composing of 4 types: man versus self, man versus man versus society, and man versus nature. The fifth element, which is the theme or the general truth in the story. And the last element is a point of view, essentially pertaining how the story is narrated or told either through the first person point of view, limited third person, or omniscient third person point of view. Alright, so that ends our study session for today. Again, a recorded video with visual presentation of this same episode can also be accessed to our social media platform pages on YouTube or Facebook. So you can pause, rewind, and go at your own pace in reviewing the contents of this study session. Thank you for tuning in with me here in 89.1 Rich Radio, #Surmang Kalangitan, Kaheten. Dakala salamat kaya kayungan my dear senior high school learners. Again mga ka-heaven, yakong kaya kayong Sir Mel Santos, and I hope what you learn in this virtual study session will help you answer all the tasks and activities in your module with more ease and understanding. Again, always refer to the table of contents so you won't miss out an activity or task. Carefully read instructions for each task or activity. And if you have questions, you can always drop me a message on my personal Facebook Messenger account. So, have a great day and bye for now, mga ka-heaven.
89.1 FM Rich Radio. Hashtag Surmount Kalamitan Ka-Heaven.